morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on navigating uncertainty, energy security and resilience, and an evolving regional context. We'll first go to Pedro Miras, the President of WPC Energy, to make some introductory remarks.
Very good day to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. I know that you are all over the world. It's a pleasure to have you all here. And so the first is a welcome to everyone to this webinar, that it is a real opportunity for us to have an important discussion after very key questions now, because today we have a time of great uncertainty. Don't forget this word, uncertainty. Second is time to face significant risks that we have to manage. And of course, it's time of unique challenges. We have been dealing with challenges for a long time. This sector knows everything about challenges, but now it's a very special moment. Well, this is going to be the first of many other webinars that will follow in the future. This is our intention because, as you know, WPC Energy is the most relevant institution to promote dialogue among all the stakeholders in energy. We are going to organize the WPC Congress. We organized the WPC Congresses. First was in 1933. And next one is going to be in Riyadh in October this year. And the following will be in Astana in 2028. And we also organize these forums, both events on a biennial basis. And this webinar is a new initiative for us that aims to address the key questions in the energy landscape in a fresh, direct, and open format. This is what we want. We will organize as many webinars as requested by the situation in the energy panorama, and I hope that this will be a complete success. And in this one, the first one that we are going to have is, there's a key word. This is uncertainty. Because uncertainty is in the head of everyone. We are facing uncertain times. So uncertainty is important. It's an important word for today. But anyway, when there is uncertainty, there's also a need for leadership. And this is what we are looking for. And when there is risk that is very close to uncertainty, there is a call for resilience. This is what we have to don't forget. And when we have challenges, of course, there are also opportunities. So as an industry, we must show our leadership in order to build this resilience and to seize the opportunity. We have to look for the opportunities. Here we are going to hear from world experts in their respective fields about how this can be done in the practical actions that we can take, because we need actions, not only theoretical things. Actions that we can take in order to analyze, anticipate the risks. Actions that we have to take in order to protect the business and the impact of uncertainty that is surrounding everything, an action that we can take in order to show the leadership that is needed and to take responsibility for a change. No? For this, resilience should be proactive, not reactive. It is clear, and now it is the time to take advantage of the closing window of opportunity. Anyway, I would like to finish with a clear call to action, because it's not only to speak about theoretical things, but also action. So while we must accept the complexity and criticality of the situation, we must also understand that this is a real opportunity for improvement and development of excellence. This is what we have to look for: excellence through better science, smarter work practices, and the sustainable development of our people, business, and the industry as a whole. So action is crucial, and let's see what recipe we can hear today from our excellent panelists. To those that I congratulate, thank you very much for joining us for this. You are key persons not only in this webinar, but in the energy landscape. In closing, in action to the webinar series, in addition, I would like to invite you to continue important conversation for the future of energy, but in person. And for this, please join us to our flagship event. It's going to be the 25th Congress, WPC Energy Congress, that under the theme Pathway to an Energy Future for All will take place in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, from 11 to 15 October of this year. And as you know, we bring together global energy leaders, policymakers, experts across the energy value chain, and we are going to discuss all things regarding transition to a secure, sustainable, inclusive, global energy system. So thank you for coming, all of you, and we look forward to welcome you not only here to the webinar, but also to our congress in October next year. Thank you very much, and now I think we have a video.
In racing, energy is everything. It's what drives performance, powers every lap, and keeps us pushing beyond limits. The world of energy is no different, and just like motorsports, teamwork and innovation will decide who takes the lead. This year, the global energy community comes together to set the pace. Book your place now for the 25th WPC Energy Congress.
I'm sorry if that glitched for anybody. That was a fantastic video. Looking forward to WPC in Riyadh later on this year. So before we start, I'd like to say a huge thank you to WPC Energy, the Resilience World Nexus, and to Petroleum Economist for putting this together today. And how did we get here? Let's just take a second to reflect back on what's happened since the 28th of February. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz slowed from 80 plus vessels a day to a mere trickle. And the effect on global maritime commodity exchange has been pretty dramatic. As we know, 25% of maritime oil, 20% of global fertilizers, 50% of the world's sulfur, a third of the world's methanol, and others as well, graphite, aluminium, helium. These are globally traded commodities, and it is going to echo around the world in the weeks, the months, the years to come. And I believe it's no exaggeration to say that the efficiency of the globalization model has been fundamentally undermined by the closure of a 20-mile strait. The impact is not simply the material reduced supply, but the loss of predictability, the single most destabilizing variable in world trade. No country, no business, no community, no family, and no individual is going to be immune to the impacts and effects of what has happened over the recent months. What we need to do is to anticipate better where these effects are going to land and to prepare for them. And I'm joined by a panel of experts today to talk through this. First and foremost, Chris Hulat, delighted to have you with us, the founder of Octopus Group, a globally respected commentator on financial and energy markets. Chris describes himself as an entrepreneur. I think that's pretty modest. I would probably describe him as an inspiration for a whole new generation of entrepreneurs. We're also joined by Dr. Ivan Martin. He is a strategic visionary in the world of oil, gas, and green energy. With over 40 years' experience advising some of the world's most influential organizations, I've heard it said that if people had listened to him for the last 20 years, and a lot of smart people did, we wouldn't be where we are today. So I strongly urge you to listen to him today so that we're in a better place tomorrow. Next up is Kathy Seifus, the Global Risk Advisory Lead for Marsh Risk. She is a dedicated expert on supply chain and has just published a book 7 days ago called, and I'm going to have to look the title up, Risk Management for Third Parties and Supply Chains. I've bought a copy. I've started reading it. It is excellent, but it couldn't be better timing, Kathy. Obviously, the publication of this book as a textbook for people trying to navigate supply chain issues. Next up, Cedric Marigi. He's the Chief Resilience Officer at Group Resilience. He has a reasonable claim to be the grandfather of business resilience, having worked for over 20 years as a Chief Resilience Officer, advising Fortune 500 companies on what to do in resilient situations across multiple different sectors. And last but not least, Abhilash Panda from the UNDRR. He is a visionary figure in the world of disaster risk reduction with a passion for making institutions talk to businesses and financiers, bringing them together to reduce disaster risk in the real world and make a meaningful difference to people, to businesses, and communities. It's an incredible panel. It's enough from me. The way this will work is I will talk to each of the panelists in turn, pose some questions, and then we will have time for Q&A at the end. So please, where you see the Q&A button on your screens, please do use this. If we don't have time to answer every question, don't worry. We will pick it up afterwards and we will publish this in post-webinar reports. So, enough from me. I'm going to turn first of all to Chris and ask him a nice, gentle question. Chris, the financial markets have been especially volatile in the last year. Everyone's very focused on the current supply chain issue in the Gulf as being a major catalyst of that. But how much is that masking other drivers, such as the AI gold rush, the dominance of the Mag 7 companies, and the tariff uncertainty? Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to the webinar today, and thanks for your kind introduction earlier. The stock markets have been volatile. They fell pretty sharply in early March, but I think it's been quite remarkable the way they have bounced sharply since then. Today we have the S&P 500 and Nasdaq pretty much at all-time highs. The AI boom is clearly driving the share prices of a number of the larger players on the US market, and that is very much reflected in things like semiconductor companies where share prices have bounced a lot over the past few months. But there's also been, looking backwards, some strong corporate earnings for businesses across a whole range of sectors, and that has continued to lead to that market strength. US retail investors have been very strong again over the past few months, buying on any kind of dip. And we've had, even in the last couple of days, many of the US investment banks have had upgrades to their forecast for the S&P for the end of the year. So there's that sort of backdrop of market strength, which may seem a little surprising in that wider context, as you said earlier. There are definitely some things that worry me. I think the AI companies are absolutely priced for perfection, and the market will be very intolerant of any kind of disappointment from them going forwards. Every 20 years we have a boom in the markets like this, and people always say, oh, this time it's different. And in the end, they are always wrong. And I think that will be the case again. How will the huge capex in the AI sector pan out? Will people make any kind of financial return on that? Who will the benefits accrue to? I think those are questions that we may start to see answers to over the next 6 to 12 months. All corporates are talking about AI and how they can put that to work in their organization, how they can use that to drive efficiency. But overall, the stock market headlines, I think, mask some challenges that are starting to emerge. Lots of businesses are seeing problems with energy prices going up, raw materials, logistics, so many facets that are playing into the cost base of businesses, and that is starting to have to be passed on to consumers. And I'm really worried about the outlook for consumer spending. More income being spent on energy bills, the economic uncertainty, some job losses in certain sectors. In the end, this will flow through into the consumer sector. Some businesses are already starting to report on that at the moment, and I think we will see this flow into overall stock market challenges in the months ahead as people start to differentiate from the AI boom and the wider economic impact on everything else.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris. It's a very comprehensive answer in a remarkably short space of time to a complex question. I'm going to shift lanes slightly now and talk more about the impact on the energy market. I heard a quote recently that the current situation, it may be the greatest catalyst ever for the energy transition and perhaps for pushing forward innovation within the oil and gas sphere. What would your take on that be?
Absolutely. This has really focused minds across the entire energy industry, whether you're talking about oil and gas or nuclear, fusion, renewables. All of these sectors are trying to respond to this crisis, and I think at real pace. And you can see this in the response they're already seeing from governments who they thought energy security had become a huge issue 4 years ago, and right now that has gone back up their to-do list once again. And an immediate consequence, I think, is countries trying to figure out how can they secure their energy supplies. Keeping lights on is pretty fundamental for any government leader. Coal shipments have come back into vogue once again, clearly fallen sharply over the past 10 years, but I think this May was apparently the third highest level of coal shipped around the world in any May in history. So countries which had recently made progress and had mothballed their coal-fired power stations turn them back on. But I think this will be a fairly short-term effect. The reality is for many governments, it's another wake-up call about the need for long-term planning. And I think the route that many of them are going to take is more investment in renewables and more investment in nuclear. Take a country like South Korea, a place I visit quite regularly. We have quite a number of institutions there who are clients of Octopus, investing in energy assets around the world with us. In South Korea, they're restarting nuclear plants. They've accelerated plans to build renewables that had been going a bit slow over the past few years. And the South Korean president has said this is his top priority every day, and national survival is at stake. You know, there is nothing really stronger than that, I think, for a government to make sure that they have the energy they need. And we see that playing through not just at corporate level or government level, but also amongst domestic households. In the UK, Octopus is seeing very high demand over the last couple of months from households to buy solar panels and also particularly to buy home batteries as well. Maybe 5 years ago, these were not particularly cheap purchases for households. They needed a lot of subsidy to make it work. They don't anymore. They're economic. They feel accessible to people. And this is not something to do with net zero. You know, net zero's had this political polarization in many countries. But what is driving the uptake of these domestic renewable kits right now is simply getting access to power at cheap rates for households. And this is, I think, a trend that's going to really continue throughout the rest of this year.
And this at this micro domestic level is still obviously a very positive thing, but I sensed a bit of frustration in your answer that this is yet another wake-up call. What do governments need to do better working with international organizations, working with business, working with the banks? What do they need to do better to stop this repeated wake-up call every couple of years?
Absolutely right. There is definitely frustration. I think that we sort of lost a bit of the momentum that was there a few years ago. And I think some of that came about because governments got distracted with other priorities. As I said a minute ago, net zero started to become a bit more of a contested political issue in countries like the UK. Right now, I think what we need is clear policies around how to stimulate investment into energy assets of all types. And that needs really clarity from governments as to what they want to encourage investment into, what the tax regime is going to look like, what investment incentives will there be. Again, in the UK, we've started to see the government rowing back on some very long-term incentives that have been in place for renewable assets, where they have tinkered with the long-term grandfathering of certain of the incentives. That sort of behavior doesn't play well with investors. So I think consistency from governments around how they want to drive the building of energy assets, how they're going to take a route to energy security, policy consistency is absolutely key. International bodies clearly have a role to play in that. There's going to need to be close collaboration between countries in places like Europe, where what assets you build, how they work together across regional grids is really important, how you integrate renewable power at scale. This is going to need careful organisation and collaboration. Many countries rely on interconnectors to supply power from neighbouring countries. Are they going to be reliable? Do you know that your neighbour is going to continue to send power down that cable at all times? So I think these government links with oversight from international bodies is going to be really important. And I think businesses clearly got a role to play. Many businesses taking things into their own hands in terms of planning for their own energy efficiency. We've worked with a lot of businesses that are doing things like putting solar panels on their rooftop of a factory, which maybe they looked at over the years, never got around to doing. Now, very much has been the catalyst to encourage businesses around the world to think about how much energy do they use, what time of day do they use it, can they shift that consumption around to cheaper times, and how can they use things like batteries to give themselves guaranteed access to power when they need it.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. And I hear you echoing that point about incentivization and the frustration of this being rowed back. Maybe we will have time later on to get back onto that, because this is an important subject at every single layer. I think I'm going to turn to Evan and ask a question building on Chris's comments. How can companies and countries assure better energy security moving forward? Chris has given some examples there, but what is this? A diversification around geographical supply? What can countries and companies do?
Well, reality is that energy security is now the key priority for countries and companies. I mean, sustainability, affordability are important, but they are probably less critical than having access or having secure energy. And in order to achieve security, we need to ensure energy autonomy. And I say autonomy and not independence because full independence is not possible. Even in the US, that is in a position right now to export oil and gas, the US is still dependent on the import of liquids and certain types of crude. So if we want to ensure energy security, the first thing we need to do is we need to ensure geographical diversification. The Middle East will remain an important supplier going forward, but new geographies are going to become relevant. The Atlantic Basin is going to be more and more important, Guyana, Brazil, Venezuela, and other places. Africa, Caspian, the East Mediterranean, all these places are geographies that are going to become relevant. But also countries will need also to reduce the high dependency on single countries. For example, taking the example of Spain, Spain imports is not affected by the import from gas from the Middle East, but we import 40% of our gas from the US. Do we want to rely only on one single country? China also needs to limit its dependency from Russia. So geographical diversification is the first lever. The second lever is the energy mix diversification, as was mentioned before. We need all sorts of energy sources as energy demand is growing due to the increase in population, but also due to the increase of artificial intelligence in the developed countries and air conditioning in the less developed countries. And we need renewables and storage, and this is what all the European countries motto right now, but we also need nuclear and we need gas. And in certain countries, they need even coal in order to make sure they have access to cheap energy. But we don't also tend to forget something that is very important. We also need energy access. Emerging countries need to go from darkness to light. They need to provide access to energy to their citizens. And many emerging countries have never had their industrial revolution. So they need to find a way to leverage their natural gas resources, accelerate industrialization in the area of sustainability. And finally, we also need, in order to ensure energy security, we also need access and new infrastructures, both for electron and molecules, that so far those need for infrastructures have been vastly underestimated.
Okay, so let me go back to that last point you made, because I think it's incredibly important, particularly in the more energy intensive industries. Yes, you talked about residential comfort of air conditioning, AI, but transport, manufacture of cement, of aluminium, the fabric of modern society is energy intensive. So how do we balance your call for more green electrons and green molecules? What does that look like in reality, especially in those energy intensive sectors?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is that the Gulf War or the Hormuz crisis is affecting energy intensive sectors particularly. Directly through the increase in prices of oil and gas and related liquids, but also indirectly through the increase of electricity prices, especially in the countries where gas is the one that sets the marginal price. And within those energy intensive sectors, there are sectors that are really hard to abate. And I'm talking about two things. First, the industrial sectors that require high temperatures for their industrial processes like cement, glass, steel that you were mentioned, and also certain mobility segments like aviation, maritime, heavy trucks that are also difficult to electrify. So in mobility, we need to increase the use of green molecules. We need more biofuels. We need e-fuels. We need sustainable aviation fuel. And we also need something that is very important, regulation, a regulation that incentivizes these green molecules and helps to create demand and be able to scale up the technologies. Without an adequate regulation, it will be very difficult to increase the use of green molecules. And in the industrial sectors, we need also to increase the use of green electrons and green molecules. We need more green electrons coming from renewable energy, wind, solar, biomass, and waste to energy. And we also need green molecules like hydrogen or syngas. And all this will increase both energy autonomy and sustainability.
That's fantastic. So let me just give you one last question, which is around duration. How long do you think, best case scenario, everything starts to come back to normal today in terms of the geographical disruption? How long do you think the disruption to the global supply chain or to energy markets is likely to last?
Yeah, I think that's the key question, and I don't think anyone can answer that question with all the information needed. Financial analysts so far have clearly underestimated the duration of the supply chain disruption and its consequences. So if we look back some weeks ago, the Brent prices dated for the end of the year, deliveries were less than 50% higher than the ones before February 28th. So there has been a clear underestimation of the duration of the disruption. And that has been probably based because a long disruption will not benefit any country. Hormuz closure obviously affects the producer countries in the region, but also raises the price levels globally in the first instance and creates volume shortages of not only gas and oil, but also, as you were mentioned in the introduction, also shortage of liquids and products, fertilizer, chemicals, and even semiconductors, because they are all affected by the lack of the raw materials. And finally, all this, if the duration is longer than expected, may end up in a systemic crisis that will affect the whole global economy. Therefore, all the stakeholders are interested and are aspiring for a quick resolution of the war. But in any case, I think that whatever is the duration of this crisis, we should be prepared for a long crisis. We should be prepared for a new normal that will affect the global energy ecosystem and build resilience and adaptability in our organizations and in our countries. For me, this is not a crisis that at some point will end. This is something that represents a structural change, and we need to be prepared for that.
Thank you very much for that. I think that systemic crisis is going to be a really interesting point, actually, to switch on to supply chain. We will evolve. Where we see systemic crisis, we will evolve. We will develop structural changes that will help to outmanage that systemic crisis. But let me go across to Kathy and first of all ask a very general question around supply chain, and then let's go back onto that point. So my feeling is most organizations have got a pretty good handle on what they need to be doing with their tier one suppliers. They know what the implications of the uncertainty over oil and other commodity prices is. I believe there is a fundamental problem across most industries that they don't understand their deeper supply chain, those tier two, tier three suppliers. And so the question for you, Kathy, is to what degree does real supply chain maturity rely not just on understanding your tier ones, but digging really deep into the fundamental pyramid of that global supply chain?
Yeah, thank you, Rich. I mean, to start with, the majority of risk tends to sit at your tier twos and tier threes, so beyond your immediate suppliers that you know about. That's where 80% of the disruption risk actually sits, and under 10% of organizations have this level of visibility of their upstream network, and so they're unable to manage it. And I think we'll continue to see the conflict in the Middle East percolate through supply chains because of this. We just don't have visibility to understand how events like this will play out. So that really highlights to me why true resilience requires upstream visibility. And depth and understanding are two key words that stand out for me. First of all, you need to understand why you want to seek better understanding of your network. Is it because you want to protect your supply availability? Is it sanctions exposure? Is it reputational risks? Because supply chain disruption can take many forms for organizations and affect many parts of the business. So first of all, I would get together with your senior leadership team and understand what kind of scope of visibility that you want to seek and build out. You want to identify what insights you want from your supply chain, and you need to understand what governance structures are going to look after that insight. But really, in practical terms, you have two options to map your supply chain. You can either take a manual approach, or you can adopt a tool that is far quicker but has an upfront cost. So if I take them in turn, the manual option would require you to maybe speak to some internal teams like your procurement team and your business continuity team to identify critical suppliers. And then you'd start with those immediate suppliers that you know about and either ask them for information about their upstream suppliers, or you can use open source information that can help you overlay different data sets such as financial health, geopolitical risk exposure, or climate event exposure, so like natural catastrophes. So you have a lot at your fingertips, and you can start with a really rudimental table, Excel, really basic tools to help you draw some insights and some really powerful conclusions. So by summarizing your upstream suppliers that you've found, you can identify concentration risks where they have an address in the same country or region. You can identify single suppliers for critical components that you've got. So I would say get going with something really simple if you don't have the upfront investment to make. But if you do have capital to put towards this, which I think is probably a sensible option, you can offer, there's loads of tools out there. I particularly work with Centrisk, and within 72 hours you can get about 60% of your upstream supply chain mapped and overlay different risk data sets to have an aggregate view of risk in your supply chain, because you don't want to have different sources that make it more confusing. You want this to be really simple for the organization to digest, and you want it to be accessible so you can interrogate it when scenarios like this play out.
I mean, that's a pretty frightening statistic that under 10% of organizations really understand their tier 2, tier 3 vulnerabilities in the supply chain. And I think this is a job that requires a certain amount of skill, and maybe actually outsourcing that skill might be the best way forward. The old saying is always, intelligence might be expensive, but it's not as expensive as ignorance. So I personally wouldn't be going to have a conversation with a board or with an executive committee if I didn't have a good characterization of my tier 1, 2, and 3 supply chain. I'm just going to change direction a little bit. I feel that most organizations do have a pretty good grip of the medium-term tactical changes they need to make to their supply chain to add to their resilience. But what do you see as being some fundamental longer-term structural changes to the global supply chain and to the supply chains that the businesses need to latch onto?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going through a kind of a shock event that's triggered a lot of change, but there have been some underlying transitions taking place thanks to events like the pandemic and the Ukraine conflict. And in this industry, the energy transition has also been driving some changes slowly. So we're kind of seeing the outcome of all these factors coming together. But I think the key change we've seen has been regionalization, where organizations are bringing processing in region or friend-shoring critical input sources. But overall, they're shortening their supply chains to reduce their exposure to disruption, because longer supply chains means a larger footprint, more nodes, and more potential for risk to manifest. And in this industry, some examples, we've seen Shell regionalize their LNG desks in Houston, London, and Singapore, and that's removed their reliance on certain choke points, but also helped them build responsiveness to demand as well. So it's not just supply that this helps. And we've also seen Saudi Aramco partner with downstream partners in Asia to localize their refining of petrochemicals, which in this instance highlights another change that we're seeing, not just regionalization, but we're seeing an increase in partnerships and integration. And that integration helps remove unknown dependencies. It brings the supply chain within the organization's control, and it helps build responsiveness if there's an issue, and it overall builds kind of credit between organizations so that they're able to mutually find a way forward when they're faced with disruption. But the overall trend is we're seeing investment in resilience over efficiency. We're no longer playing the efficiency game where we have no buffer stock and no options, and we're acting independently with a demand-led system. We're working to manage supply. And for now, I think this works. Regionalizing it makes a lot of sense, looking at the pressures that the industry is facing. But I do think it's worth noting that this may come at some other costs that we haven't seen yet. So what happens in the case of a regional disaster, and what will be the tolerance for duplicated operations and duplicated compliance needs longer term? I think that'll be interesting to see how this kind of swings and balances.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cal. I mean, some good sort of practical tips there around shortening supply chain, localization and regionalization. I love the idea of this integration, horizontal, vertical integration and partnerships. We'll come back to you again at the end, I think, just to talk some more about some practical methodologies that organizations can apply. There's a few things there structurally, and maybe we could dig down into the real tactical weeds of how you actually go about operationalizing some of those things you just described. First, I'm going to go to Cedric, and we talked a little bit about this during Kathy's answers there. You talk to board members and executive committee members every single day of your life. How worried are they? And what are you actually telling them to make them feel a bit more reassured?
Well, I think the worries about many of them, unfortunately, look at the world with 3 to 6 months lens. And what most of them struggle to envisage is actually 2 years, 3 years down the line. As of today, they are currently most of the one, and recently one yesterday was telling me, and if FTSE 100, that all their planning and the assumption was made until 2026, and at the latest with some scenario for mid-2027. But the question they're asking themselves is, with the speed in which uncertainty is growing, what kind of certainty do I have by the end of 2027? And if you think about how they need to prepare, and actually you will remember, Richard, when we were running together the COVID response, it was about not having a one-person show response. It's about having all the cumulative brain that you can have access to around your exco, and having them thinking and working together so that they can not only prepare for what could be thrown at them, but most importantly, what they could rebound from in order to gain competitive advantage. One thing is clear, you got some industry doing really well at the moment and some others that will do not well at all. And if you are one of them, you need to make sure that you're doing better than your competitors, so that whenever you will go back into business, or when the tide is somehow changing and you can go back into full stream, you have gained a competitive advantage compared to your competitors in having trained your people adequately, in having cleaned your supply book, in having optimized your supply chain distribution, taking the right time to slow down, to run faster.
Okay, I mean, I understand the point about this slightly short-term thinking by businesses, but when there is so little visibility of what the medium long term might look like, is this not simply a sensible natural reaction to shorten the focal length a little bit and concentrate on the months ahead, not the years or the decades ahead, to really focus on the immediate outlook and keeping the business alive?
I think it's a very good point, Richard, because ultimately what they need to think about is whether or not some of them will still have the light on at the end of the process. And the question is, what can they do now to make sure that how long, whatever the length of the process will be, they still have the light on, not only tomorrow, the day after, but at the end of the process. I think what I found staggering, you got some leaders when they are in fear, uncertainty, they tend to be willing to control the now, when instead some of the others are more towards, all right, something is happening, you manage the now, I'll focus on what could happen 1, 2 years down the line. Now, there's no crystal ball, right? Whoever's going to tell you is going to finish in 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, I think it's It's wishful thinking. What I do know, however, and we've seen that during COVID, you climb a hill, you don't know what you're going to find on top. And at some point, you're going to climb down. And while you're climbing down, you have opportunities that you might have not thought about before. So I don't want to be, the extra positive guy only thinking about things will get better at some point. They will. But ultimately, if you don't buy a lottery ticket, you're never going to win. So there is some action they need to take now in order to be prepared in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months down the line. Otherwise, they're not going to be fit to run whenever the opportunity will arise.
Excellent. Thank you, Cedric. So let me ask you this question. You mentioned COVID. It appears to me that the 2020s have not been the greatest decade so far for global disruptive events. We have the current supply chain issue, Brexit, conflict in Ukraine, COVID, AI. When we look back on this decade, what's the biggest disruptive event going to be? Is it one of those I've mentioned, or are you looking at something else?
I think the way I like to summarize it, which is a way that is capturing more and more attraction from the senior leadership, is, apologize for my lack of politeness, but human stupidity, machine capability, and climate hazard. You can summarize that by saying human, machine, climate. Climate disruption, climate hazard will be, I think, by far what we will see as being the worst legacy in this century. I think we haven't grasped yet, nor understood yet, what is currently thrown at us. And there is hope in the machine capabilities to help us to find ways, and I think Ivan was talking about it before, in find ways in getting somehow ahead of the curve and thinking about things we never thought before. The same way as machine can trigger some other catastrophic consequence that we haven't thought about yet. But we need to work on the human, because ultimately the human in the middle are the ones which are somehow boosting those machine capabilities with little to no control, but somehow not making a lot to help Mother Nature to still accept us, right? And climate change, climate adaptation that lead to disasters for humanity is what is of a big concern to me.
Great, thank you, Cedric. And that's a perfect segue to turn to Abhilash, whose day job is to make sure we better understand the risks to humanity and we put in place appropriate disaster risk reduction. So, Abhilash, the International Energy Agency has suggested that we may be entering the greatest ever energy crisis in history. Would you agree with this analysis? And what does it really mean globally for societal resilience?
Thanks, Richard. Also, thanks for inviting me to this. It's a very interesting discussion that you're having. Back to your question, it depends entirely on where you are sitting. If you're a finance director or investor in London or Houston, this is definitely a serious crisis, right? Volatile market, supply chain pressure, investment uncertainty. But if you are a minister of finance in Fiji, Solomon Islands, or in a landlocked country, this framing almost feels optimistic. For those countries, energy insecurity is not a new crisis. It's a chronic condition, import dependent, often running on expensive diesel, with no buffers, no hedging tools, and a fiscal space already stretched by COVID and climate shocks before any of this began. But I want to, if I had to, then I would add a dimension that I think is still underweighted in most of these conversations. Climate risks to energy assets themselves. We talk about energy security as if the infrastructure is a given, as if the pipelines, the refineries, the transmission networks, the ports through which fuel moves, a stable backdrop to a geopolitical story. They're not. We are seeing increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, you name it, cyclones, floods, heat stress, wildfires, directly damaging and disrupting energy infrastructure. A category 4 typhoon or cyclone does not distinguish between a gas terminal and a village. Subsea cables, coastal refineries, hydropower systems dependent on predictable rainfall all of these are undergoing physical stress from a changing climate. And that stress compounds every geopolitical shock we are already dealing with. So when IEA says greatest crisis in history, I would agree, but the full picture is one of the compounding vulnerabilities, geopolitical disruption, structural fragility in the most import-dependent economies, and accelerating physical risk to the very assets the global energy system depends on. That's not one crisis. That's in fact three crises converging, and the most vulnerable countries are at the intersection of all the three.
So I know we've discussed this before many times. Regulation sometimes isn't everyone's favorite thing in business, but actually CS-DDD, EU taxonomy are very clear about the importance of double materiality, that it isn't just about more sustainable energy, it is about more sustainable energy infrastructure. And I, for one, think that's a great thing. You know, there's a bit of carrot and stick there. There's quite a lot of stick, but this is definitely a positive change. I think perhaps one of the issues you touched on there that I'd like to expand on a bit. It's quite easy to map out that if we see a global downturn, where that's likely to land in terms of the greatest societal impacts. You can look at food security, energy security, medical stability. Actually, it looks like that will have a significant impact on some emerging economies. We can anticipate it easy enough. What are some practical steps we could use to mitigate that? And how does the global economy need to contribute to that?
Well, thanks, Richard. Maybe three things need to happen simultaneously, and in fact, they really do. First, is we need to shift from reactive response to genuine anticipatory action. Right. The conceptual shift is simple, but the operational change is hard. So stop waiting for the crisis to hit before releasing resources. Or what that means in practice is pre-arranged triggers, financial instruments or vehicles that are structured in advance, linked to defined thresholds, whether that's an oil import bill crossing a certain percentage of GDP, a currency hitting a stress level, or a commodity price shock model flagging an imminent affordability crisis. Now, the humanitarian sector has been pioneering anticipatory finance for disaster response. I mean, it's already tested, tried, and it works. Pre-positioned funds that release automatically when conditions deteriorate. So that same logic needs to be applied to energy price stress, maybe before supply disruptions translate into fuel shortage or rationing and social unrest. One thing leads to another. It's not that one thing, this happens and then it stops there. We think the tools are there. The problem is the decision making, the political will to pre-commit resources before you can see the disaster unfold and become the front page. Second is I think we need to close the protection gap through smarter risk transfer. Parametric insurance and risk pooling mechanisms have been working. They can be adapted for energy price stress. They're not perfect, but they provide fast, prearranged liquidity exactly when a government needs it most, before this social damage compounds into something much harder and more expensive to fix. Third, and I think that has to do with the institutional gap that frustrates us creates quite a lot of challenges. The diagnosis is rarely the problem. Vulnerability assessment exists. The data on which countries are most exposed to is available. The problem is that this knowledge sits in one silo. The decision and instruments are designed in another, and the actual policy decisions are being made in third. So the coordination burden alone is a barrier. Connecting the dots between vulnerability information, pre-structured instruments, decision-making capacities where I think we need to put our foot on.
Okay, so this is a perfect link to a question from Chris Needham Bennett that has phrased it better than I ever could. And Abhilash, I'm going to ask you this first and then maybe go to Chris as well, as I imagine your answer will be quite different. Chris's question is this too important to be left to politicians? In other words, should markets dictate policies? So, Abhilash, is this too important to be left to politicians? You should just let the markets determine the future?
Well, you cannot. I don't think so. I mean, you need both. I also put UNDRI into that mix, or the global organization like UN into the mix of this, right? Has Because we have been historically been better at producing frameworks and reports than at driving capital to where it's needed or translating strategy into operational change. And that's where you need the private sector, the businesses to come in. And I think we are changing. I mean, like for instance, the corporate chief resilience officers network, or which brings together some of the large corporates into the works of disaster risk reduction, is one of those examples. But creating that interface between public and private is easy said than actually done. We all keep on talking about PPPs, but in making that happen is more critical. If we are talking about having frameworks in place, it needs to be co-designed with the private sector. Because at the end of the day, I think Kathy mentioned, you need to understand the tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. And this is not just the responsibility of one company or one government. You need to both be together in that.
Excellent. Thank you, and a very diplomatic answer as well. I will remind everyone, please do drop any questions on the Q&A, but Chris, I'm going to throw that question to you as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think to me, a lot of the progress that we need in terms of building energy infrastructure, I think needs government and investors to work hand in hand. If I think of our activities building, say, renewable generating assets around the world, what we really need is to understand from governments what type of assets do they want, where do they want them, how will they interplay with things like grid. We want quick access to planning decisions, quick access to knowing whether we can get a grid connection. If government can create the right framework, there's plenty of capital in the world that can then help to build those assets. Where things I think get challenging is when those decisions take years and years and when government policies are inconsistent. What I'm not a fan of is governments kind of mandating pots of capital like pension funds and saying, you must invest in this offshore wind farm we're building in such and such. That I think is the wrong way to go. But I think if you create the right conditions for capital, it will flow.
Excellent. Okay, well, I mean, that's reassuring anyway, that investors want, back to what we talked about right at the beginning, predictability, policy predictability, economic predictability. They need to be able to know where things are going to go and that things aren't going to change 3 years after an investment decision is made. So it makes a lot of sense. Even I'm going to go to you. We are getting close towards the end, and I want to make sure that we capture some bullet points from you. If you were talking to a CEO or a minister right now, short, sharp recommendations about resilience, what should they be doing?
I think they should be prepared to face a greater uncertainty, and therefore they should be very adaptable. And they should increase also the dialogue between governments and the industry. I think that in a way we have been lacking that kind of dialogue. And we need to have a policy making, regulation that is really something that incentivizes and facilitates rather than focus on penalizing or forbidding.
Excellent. That was a strong executive summary of a lot of complex thought. We've got a question here, Kathy, throwing it across to you. You've kind of alluded to this already, but how do you see supply chains actually evolving? Not just your recommended good practice, but local or global, shorten or extend, increase of storage or increase of efficiency. How do you see it happening?
I think we are seeing the pendulum swing. So I think we'll see an extreme swing to regionalization, not necessarily localization, but I think at least regional. And I've mentioned before how I see, especially this industry, applying that strategy. But I think it may take a bit of time until we reach the end of that swing. I think organizations that are not used to investing in resilience are adopting a bit of a wait and see policy and kind of waiting for the other big players to make the first move. So I think we'll see a bit of percolation of that strategy, and then maybe a rebalancing. So I think it will depend on the industry as to how far we see it percolate. I think retail, for example, textiles, they may like to, quick fashion may stay regionalized because they can meet the demand, and oil and energy may follow. As we see such demand volatility, it may suit them, but I think we'll see a little bit of a balance of maintaining a bit of globalization in there, but just because of the level of resilience it provides.
Excellent. Thank you, Kathy. And Cedric, nice, easy question for you. You're asked to come in front of the chairman. He wants to know if it's worth investing in resilience or not. Can you make a financial argument in 2 sentences?
What's the cost of not investing in resilience? I think for me, that's the biggest question, right? And whenever the CFO has been asking us those questions, it was quite cumbersome to explain to them that not investing in the future is about not being ready for the future. And because we don't know exactly what the future is going to hold, we better have a good idea about how much we're ready to lose if we don't have the right resilience team. And ultimately, the resilience team is nothing else than a group of people working together with the same goal. Those people can be exco, could be people on the ground, but it's just breaking silos and building bridges in between functions. Technically, it doesn't cost much. And I think Abhilash is a perfect example. Together with him, we built the CCRO network. It costs nothing to the company that helped them to build that, and it's a win-win for everyone.
Thank you for that, Cedric. And it's really interesting when I look back on the notes I've taken from what people have said here. Cedric emphasizing horizon scanning, Abhilash talking about anticipation, sophisticated anticipation, Kathy talking about applying intelligence, really understanding your tier 2, tier 3s, Chris, incentivization. That was the big word I wrote down. It seems to be so often that it is the stick and not the carrot that's applied. And the carrot is a much more powerful device to elicit change. And even talking about systemic crisis, prepare for systemic crisis, don't duck away from it. Actually, this can be leveraged. There is an opportunity in systemic crisis for innovation, for reinvention, for revolution. And actually that needs to be seized because these crises are going to keep on coming. And as we've said so many times, you can't keep being surprised every 2 years when there's a new global crisis. I'm conscious that we're now run out of time. I'd like to thank the panelists hugely. It's been an extraordinary amount of information in 1 hour, and it's going to take a lot of time to go back over and dissect some of the commentary that you've given. I really appreciate you giving up your time. I am extremely excited about the Resilience World Nexus coming to London. I'm excited about WPC Energy in Riyadh. These are 2 huge events. We are going to continue the discussion leading up to these. It's great to know that we'll have people with this level of expertise speaking on the panel. So once again, Ivan, Chris, Abhilash, Kathy, Cedric, thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure everyone that's listened has gained a huge amount of insight from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.